Hi, everybody, and welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we have been exploring history, religion, and culture and why they matter. And of course, Mount Olympus being the place where the Greek gods lived, and then in an Olympian judgment being that dispassionate, impartial assessment which we are aspiring to. But it's another foggy day, as usual. My name is Coel Campo.
And I'm Mike Pierce, and this is the sixth and final episode in our series on my now slightly elderly book, Why the Rest Hates the West. If today's episode leaves you a little confused as to why we're talking about this subject, we really would urge you to go back and look at previous episodes, perhaps especially the first one, and then you'll see the context into which this whole discussion fits. The last couple of chapters deal with an issue which by now is the commonplace of so much public discussion. But when the book first came out, I really gulped a few times, wondering whether I should include this subject matter at all, because there were only a very few people talking about that, and some of those people were downright sketchy. But nevertheless, the transformation since then has been so dramatic that this is now mainstream discussion, and that's the whole topic of demographic collapse. I don't know, have you been following this kind of some of these kind of podcasts or news reports along these lines?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I feel like in pop culture, the prevailing opinion is still that there's too many people, that overpopulation is a problem, and sort of going along with the themes that we've talked about before. I think a very strong opinion is why would you bother to bring more people into this, sort of cruel and dying world, so to speak. And of course, this being, Western pop culture, it's always a little bit dismal. So but that's sort of the prevailing public opinion that I tend to see, which is why I found this chapter in your book extremely interesting.
Right. Well, the to be honest, I don't see a lot of the stuff that I think that you're seeing. Certainly, I did when I was a lot younger, but it seems like all of the contributions now are coming from people with a range of different opinions about demographic collapse. There were some things I was saying in the book that were downright wrong, and we're going to touch on those. But just to give a little context here, in 1968, and for a couple of years after that, one worldwide best-selling book was Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb. And the title of that book became like a standard expression. He predicted that global overpopulation would lead to mass starvation in the 1970s and 1980s. And I mean, he was completely wrong about that. There have been famines since then, but all of them have been caused by politics, not by climate or crop failure. The classic example would be Ethiopia in the early to mid 1980s, which was a result of the communist government under Colonel Mengistu, which led to famously worldwide efforts of bringing aid, supported by pop groups in Western countries and all that kind of thing.
And perhaps famously why mothers still say to their children when they don't like the dinner that's being served to them, if you don't eat that, I'm going to send it to the starving children in Africa.
Right, right. Gosh, I haven't heard that line in quite a few years now. I mean, I did when I was a kid, but I didn't realize that people still said that. Wow, am I out of touch?
I don't think they do.
Well, now, Ehrlich certainly did have a very important point, because from where he and we were all standing in 1968, things looked pretty scary. So, through all prehistory and all recorded history, up to about 1805, the world's population finally grew to 1 billion people. Before that, significantly lower. Around the time of Christ, it's probably around 300 million people. For context, that's slightly fewer people than you have in the US today. That would have been the global population at the time of Christ. By 1805, it gets to a billion. So since forever, back whenever, to 1805, 1 billion, it took just 125 years after that to get to 2 billion, and just 30 years after that to get to 3 billion, right, by 1960. And we've been adding a further billion, approximately, I'm simplifying here, approximately every 12 years since then. And we're just now just a little north of 8 billion. And that's kind of scary because obviously population growth and economic growth into finite resources is self-evidently. And so there was something to worry about.
Right.
Now, what Ehrlich was doing was in some ways resurrecting a rather older theory coming from just before global population reached its first billion. And that is the work of the Reverend Thomas Malthus. He is so famous that his surname has become an adjective, Malthusian, to describe this particular way of reasoning. His theories have always been controversial, but in many ways quite persuasive and continue to be relevant, certainly from the point of view of people like Ehrlich. So his most famous book by far is an essay on the principle of population coming out in 1798. So for context, at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And he said that the increase of population is necessarily limited by the means of subsistence. What he means is by the food supply. That population does invariably increase when the means of subsistence increase, until the limits of subsistence were once again reached, which led to higher mortality, not just from starvation, but because of if people are underfed, they're more susceptible to illnesses that wouldn't otherwise have killed them, and decreased birth rates, same cause. Now, what was so depressing about this was the conclusion that poverty and misery of the masses was a natural equilibrium point for human population. You might get out of it at some points, but when you did, it was because the food supply relative to population had improved, and that meant the population would increase until you got back to the misery level again. And war, sickness, and hunger were the normal enforcers of this, but he held out a little glimmer of hope. Late marriage, birth control, and unwed celibacy could raise living standards and increase stability.
Which is interesting because I feel like that is really what we see in the West in a nutshell.
Well, we're nowhere remotely close to starvation. Quite the opposite. Westerners maybe I don't know, about 9 or 10% of the global population, but maybe more like 20% by weight. But but certainly we are consuming resources at a terrifying rate. Now, Malthus has been ridiculed since, but also it's kind of hard to escape the logic of what he's arguing. And this, along with some other things, have led to renewed interest in recent years in eugenics. Now, eugenics is the science, science, very often pseudoscience, discussing, uh, how big the human population should get, and should we select who gets to be born and who may breed and this kind of thing. Now, just to give a little context here, and this is a topic to which we may well return in future episodes at some point. Eugenics was a very popular liberal cause in the early 20th century. So all kinds of rationalists, secular people, liberals of all kinds, and certain kinds of Protestants actually espoused this in Britain and America and Germany and many other countries. But it was utterly discredited by the experience of Nazism, and so went in a long retreat. But it's become newly popular, in part as a result of population scares. Now, Adam Rutherford he is an academic, but his book is not academic. It's intended for a general reading public. His book Control just came out a couple of years ago, traces the history of this idea and pulls really no punches, but he's not polemical. Nobody comes out of it particularly well. Well, what's right and wrong about the dismalist analysis of Malthus on the one hand and Ehrlich on the other? Well, on the one hand, it has some history on its side. That's at the time Malthus was writing, that seemed to account for quite a lot of human history up to that point. And obviously, as I've said, infinite expansion, whether of the economy or of population, and those are closely bound together, into finity is nonsense. But neither Malthus nor Ehrlich took enough account of technological improvements in agriculture. What's in fact happened since 1968 until about 10 years ago is that increases in global food output outstripped the admittedly massive increases in the global population. But about 10 years ago, that stopped. And so things are tightening up. If you want to know one of the underlying reasons, never mind immediate politics, why prices in your grocery store are going up, it's going to be that. Also, they didn't take account of the fact that almost all modern famines are caused by politics, not by nature. And the analysis also took no account of the problems that the supposed solution would produce, and that's population decline. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about today. Now, during one of my many previous incarnations, I was a factory worker in West Germany during the mid 1970s, just for a year, you understand. And this famous headline, I was actually living there and saw this magazine when it came out. And at the time, my eyes popped out of my head. So, Der Spiegel, a very highly regarded news magazine in Germany. So, this cover story, Sterben die Deutschen aus, are the Germans dying out? And the spoiler alert, they were, if you like, the canary in the coal mine. They were one of the few societies that had already tipped over into long-term population decline or sub-replacement birth rates at any rate.
And you said at the time that you would have seen this. This was not the prevailing opinion.
Ehrlich's book was still making
Right.
all the headlines, and that whole way of talking that had almost immediately become received wisdom. And so the German West German experience was the kind of, oh, wait a minute, maybe not, kind of exception to that rule. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
perhaps because of this way of thinking, China from 1979 until 2015 introduced a one-child policy. That is, that each couple could have only one baby. And this was forced partly through intense official propaganda. There was intense personal pressure put on people not to have more than one child. There were forced abortions, forced sterilizations. There were fines and other punishments imposed on people who did manage to evade the ban. And one of the many side products, free market types are fond of pointing out the unintended consequence of the situation with statist economic measures, and that's true. That's not always necessarily a reason not to follow them, but there's a lot of truth in that. But the same thing applies to non-economic measures like this. So people will pursue their own interests despite or working around official rules. So a majority of people preferred to have boys rather than girls, and that led to this huge gender imbalance in two generations of Chinese. 117 boys born for every 100 girls. If you want to know what the normal ratio is, it's about 105 or 106 boys for every 100 girls. The gender imbalance at the young age has obviously undesirable effects once those kids grow up, including sexual and other violence, and that's going to last the entire life course of those two generations. What the Chinese government was afraid of was that at existing rate of Chinese population increase, there would be mass starvation. Now, it's very tempting to be sarcastic here and say, well, they didn't really care about mass starvation. Look at this graph and look at the eye popping bit over on the left hand side there, right? In 1960 and just after, the death rate soared, the birth rate plummeted, and the former outmatched the latter. Why? Because 30 million Chinese died in a man-made famine as a result of the collectivization of farms. Now, the same policy had been pursued under Stalin 30 years earlier in the Soviet Union, and that had led to at least 5 million deaths. And in full knowledge of this, the communist government did the same thing in China. But you can see the birth rate goes soaring right afterwards and is choked back by the one-child policy. But of course, what that means is, just as with very large birth increases, that will have a multiplier effect a generation further up the road. So with very large birth decreases, that will have a reinforcing effect a generation up the road. So a couple of years ago, China actually finally went into population decline because the birth giving cohort of the population is now getting smaller than the death, than, or at least in terms of the births they're having, than the actual death rate.
And this is something that they've done away with now, the one child policy.
Yes.
But the problem being that now you have two generations of people who still have this feeling of, well, maybe having lots of children is not a great idea.
Yes.
Right.
Because despite the way that lots of conspiracy minded people, and in this part of the world, I'm afraid, certain kinds of nationalists talk, nobody at all has babies for political reasons, and only a very few for religious reasons. It comes from a generalized culture of acceptance of having children, or of its opposite. Yeah. But the other thing that's true is if you have a birth spike, you have predestined an even bigger birth spike 20 to 30 years up the road. If you push right down on births, as the Chinese government did, and make sure that nobody has more than one child, you have predestined a population collapse a generation up the road. And of course, this is what's happened.
Right.
Well, so far, so little about my book. Just reminding people why the rest hates the West was looking not at international politics so much, well, hardly at all, actually, a factor which seems to have infuriated some of those who are commenting on our videos online on YouTube and Spotify and so on, who want that kind of discussion. But we're looking at the cultural and behavioural patterns of Westerners which have been exported towards the non-West and caused deep unease. And the attitudes that have led to population decline are part of that. What we saw in Germany as early as the mid 1970s, we now see generally across the West. Or at least by the time I was writing the book in the early 2000s, that was general across the West. One of the things that's changed, we'll get to in a moment, is that it's now general across most, by no means all, of the world. So in the book, I point out the reasons for population decline. Now they, just to forfend people getting too angry too quickly, I'm not saying that all of these are necessarily bad things or good things. I'm saying that they're things, and that in combination, they are exerting remorseless downward pressure on Western populations. So contraception, which finally becomes actually, I don't know, 98% reliable from the 1960s and helps to fuel the sexual revolution. The unintended consequences of that and the impact on family structure and so on. Abortion, which became legal in most Western countries in the wake of the sexual revolution. So, for example, 1967 in Britain, 1973 in the US, and that kind of period in most other Western countries. Greater career opportunities for women, which means delayed childbirth, and as I've said separately here, postponed motherhood. I mean, your kind of age cohort, would you say that only a minority of your age peers are now married, and a minority even of that minority actually are mothers and fathers?
Yeah, I think my demographics for this are a little bit skewed because, the people that I run in circles with are mostly in a religious environment, and so it's probably not not as indicative of the society at large. But I do think this is absolutely true, and I think what goes along with this is and maybe you'll disagree with me, but the push for feminism, I think, is a big driver of this, that women can have careers or should have careers.
Yeah, feminism is something that is actually kind of very tricky to define. It's one of those things, like in religious life in England in the 16th and 17th centuries, Puritanism. It's a direction of thought, and everybody, or perhaps the best metaphor is it's like a bus, and pretty much everybody gets on it at some point, and then people get off where they feel like it, and the person who got off before you is wishy-washy, and the person who stayed on after you got off is an extremist. So yeah. So feminism is kind of tricky from that point of view. But yeah. I think we all know what you mean
Yeah.
there. Yes, yes. And certainly, I mean, one of the big points that Why the Rest makes is that this kind of collapse in birth rates has affected religious subpopulations much less and much later than more secular ones. Well, one of the most dramatic examples of that, and we covered it in an earlier episode, in the first series we did, is to look at Israel and the huge differential in the birth rates between the Orthodox Jewish community, which is way, way more than replacement rate, and the secular Jewish population, which is basically the same as secular West Europeans or East Coast Americans.
Yeah, and I think it's worth bringing up too that postponed motherhood is not always by choice. I hear more and more stories of women who wish that they could have babies and aren't.
Right, because they can't find a reliable male provider. And this is one of the huge long term consequences of the sexual revolution of the 1960s and family disintegration and the differential effects that's had on, I'm going to say typical, because immediately people are going to get mad at this very contentious subjects. Typical behavior of men, typical behavior of women. And of course, there are outliers in both directions for both men and for women. So let's just go with typical. The typical behavior of both genders has been impacted enormously by the sexual revolution. In the case of men, it has reinforced the natural male tendency to be feckless and non-committal many times. And so, with the kind of result that you're talking about, yeah. One thing that I didn't realize until just several months ago, actually, is that amongst women in Western countries who are having children, the number of children that they're having is about the same now as it was in the 1970s. So it's averaging about 2.6 or 2.7 per woman who has children. But what's caused the
Wow.
collapse is the huge increase in the number of women who never have children. And as you rightly say, for loads of those, maybe a majority, I don't know, that is not by choice. It probably is a majority, actually, because if you ask most young women around 2021, do you plan to have children someday? The vast majority still say yes. And yet, 30-40% of them will not. So, yeah. Well, greater life expectancy crowds out room for having children because there's more old people. And they need looking after and paying for by one mechanism or another. And that's a point, again, to which we will return. The general acceptance of homosexuality, it affects things only at the edges with a pretty small percent, but it's one more downward pressure, right? That now we no longer have a situation where, regardless of your predilections, you're expected to get married and breed. It's perfectly acceptable now to stand outside of that. Also, hedonism and consumerism, which I may possibly a little too much fun of in Why the Rest. People choosing in their early years of married life or being together as a couple, choosing great Greek vacations over babies and then delaying things, and finding that the biological clock has run out. Also,
Right.
loss of belief in the future. And again, I want to stress nobody, I think, except nutcases, has babies or refuses to have babies for political reasons. But if there is a general confidence in the future or hope in the future amongst a population, they are much more at a psychological level likely to have children. Where they're extremely pessimistic, as our populations are now, there are a lot of people who will say, I think it's just too much of a risk.
We talk about that a lot in, I believe it's the second episode of this series, and sort of look at a general loss of purpose over time, which contributes to feelings of hopelessness.
Yes, yes, yes. Do go back and have a look at that one, people, if you haven't already, where we look at tradition, progress, and then going nowhere. Yeah, yeah, that's right. But we also need to mention the effect of old age pensions, which everyone's going to say, well, that's got to be a good idea. These only really come in the late 19th century in Germany, in the early 20th century in the other Western countries. But at the time they came in, the average life expectancy was high 40s or low 50s. Now the average life expectancy is, you know, early 80s, well, high 70s in the US, but still, same kind of thing. So at the time pensions came in, most people didn't live long enough to actually claim the pension, and they were having, you know, 4 or 5 children per couple, and now we're having 1.6 children per couple, and we're living till we're early 80s. The ratio of old people to working population is utterly transformed, and it doesn't make a huge difference whether that's done through tax and benefits, so public sector stuff, tax the workers, pay the pensioners, or whether it's done through savings. Um, a lot of people who do the latter refuse to see the obvious logic of this. Well, I paid this money in. It's not sitting there in a pool waiting for you to collect it at age 65, right? It's being put to work and invested in the economy, and and then that feeds into interest rates and all that kind of stuff. What actually keeps it going is a functioning economy run by people who are working.
I wonder too if the original intention of this has turned into something else that I don't think it was originally intended for. I mean, at least in America, right? Like the dream of retiring at 65 is so that you can sort of sit around and play golf or whatever else it is that old people do. I'm not really sure. I think that in itself, it has to be a very Western idea of, well, I've earned this right to now sit around and enjoy my life.
Well, I think at the time, I mean, well, one has to think that up until then, all recorded history, old people are supported by their children, which is one more reason why everybody wanted to have children, right? They were, if you made it to old age, they were your insurance and your support. The other thing to remember is that life was much harder. You look at old photographs, even from 2 generations ago, but certainly from the early 20th century, and look at someone of age 65 then and compare them with someone age 65 today. I mean, the contrast is stark because today's 65-year-old has, on average at least, had a much, much easier life.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was basically rescuing older people from having to continue to do hard physical labour, which very few people do now, even when they're 20 or 30. A minority still do, but most don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, look at what's happened under the impact of all these changes in a number of key Western countries. Now, for those unfamiliar with these kinds of discussions, the most important statistic to remember is that the replacement rate for a population is 2.1 babies per woman. If that's if that point is achieved, then a population will be stable, neither growing nor declining in the long term. I mean, that almost never happens, right? But that's that's the statistic. Well, in France, the birth rate is 1.79 per woman. In the UK, 1.57. In Germany, 1.53. In Italy, a catastrophic 1.3. In Spain, 1.29. Now, before we get to North America, let's just say something about those. Those figures would be even lower, significantly lower, without their fairly recently arrived immigrant populations. If they were taken out of the mix, you can knock a zero point 0.2 or maybe more off of each one of those. So those countries are all undergoing fairly rapid demographic transformation in terms of the kinds of people who live there and where their origins are and so on. Well, now, at the time I wrote the book, the US was the standout amongst Western countries in that it had a birth rate of precisely 2.1. And that could be attributed to the much greater religiosity of America compared to all other Western countries. That was very easy to see in the most religious states, the Bible Belt and so on. The birth rate was well above 2.1. And in California and on the East Coast, it was European style birth rates. Right. But what's happened since then is that America has significantly secularized, and Utah, Mormon Utah, which had a really significantly higher than 2.1 birth rate, is no longer the highest in the US. The highest now is South Dakota, and even that is under 2.1. It's 2.01. The lowest is Vermont with 1.35. Actually, Washington, D.C. is below even that, but I think that Washington, D.C. might count sociologically as an exception in other ways, so I didn't include it there. But you can see that its birth rate is well below replacement rate. And in the case of Canada, it's 1.33, which is, again, absolutely disastrous. What does this mean for the long term? Well, let's look at some figures here. The last one, very hypothetical. The population of Europe in 1850 was 270 million people. In 1910, it was 460 million. The reason it was rising so fast was because far fewer babies were dying than previously. They still had a much higher infant death rate than we do, but they were falling markedly. And so people were just having as many children as before, but more of them surviving. By 2000, that had grown to 728 million. Now, the last figure is entirely hypothetical because it will never happen. And the reason it will never happen is because those societies would totally collapse, implode. All of their structures, infrastructure, workforce, their political stability completely collapse long before that point was reached. And what that means is that something else has to happen instead. But before we get to that, let's just think about what an aging population and that kind of low birth rate means. 80% of the healthcare costs that you incur during your lifetime are incurred in old age. Right? 4/5 of it. And we've got more and more old people before, and fewer younger people to pay the costs of it, whether that's done privately or through the state. And what governments are going to find is that pension and healthcare costs are going to crowd out public spending on defence, education, roads, and infrastructure. Now, I mean, in the case of Britain, we've just had a new Labour government taken over, and everybody's totally fed up with the government that they just kicked out. That's about the only pretty nearly unanimous thing about the result of the election. It wasn't exactly a vote of confidence in Labour, but we're not going to talk about that now. But the new government is going to find that its room for manoeuvre on all the things that it wants to do is totally constrained. And it's constrained particularly by pension and healthcare costs. It needs to boost defence spending because of the emergency we're facing in Ukraine and the threat from Russia and so on. More money needs spending on schools, not because there's so many children, but because the buildings are falling to pieces and the teachers need paying more. Otherwise, they're simply going to go and do other things because we don't have enough of a working population. So you need to pay higher wages to attract people into essential lines of work. And the roads are not in a great state, and neither are the infrastructure generally. Now, all of this is going to lead to crushing tax burdens on the young and working age population. And the old debates between free marketeers, small government, and social democrats, big government, are kind of redundant here because nobody's actually really got any choice. Certain things have simply got to be done, otherwise everything falls apart. Right? And so that is making it harder and harder for people to choose to have children, quite apart from all the effects of on family life of the sexual revolution. So it creates a kind of a downward spiral. It could, in the worst case, bring about the bankruptcy of public finances. But what it means is that infrastructure is going to crumble, professionals will be in very short supply, and particularly outside of major cities and capitals, regional services are going to suffer particularly badly because they require a minimum population size to operate properly. So you think about trains, buses, hospitals, right? If there isn't a certain kind of population size, it becomes madness to keep these things functioning in a decent way. Rural areas, and we're really finding this in places like central Spain and parts of Portugal, they've got no doctor or teacher or electrician. Right? And that's going to intensify. And staffing problems for ordinary businesses are already becoming acute and are going to get worse. And particularly in the regions, as those populations sink, so does the regional tax base. So if you've got fewer and fewer people there, there's fewer people you can tax. And so the ability to fund things just collapses even further. It's a spiral.
If you were to simply do away with, the pension plans or these different systems that are um, keeping the older folks afloat, even that wouldn't solve all the problems if you were to simply to do away with those.
Well, it's hard to see how a democratically elected government could do away with those because there
Right.
being so many older people, any party that gets elected, whatever party it is, depends very solidly on older voters, and they're not going to vote to starve themselves, right? Only an authoritarian government could do that. But if it did, then yeah, those people would starve, they'd go hungry, or they'd be thrown back onto the resources of their own children. But the trouble is that an awfully
Mm.
high number of them don't have their own children. Let's just revisit the
Okay.
whole the whether it's private pension plan or a public state pension. That we're pooling resources. So instead of me in my old age being fed and looked after by my own children, I'm going to be fed and looked after by collectively our children, and that means the pressure is off me to have enough children to support me. But that's only going to work as long as everybody else doesn't calculate the same way. But they did, and here we are.
So this is not just the musings of somebody who happens to find themselves in the retirement category.
Right, right, yes, exactly. And any moves, even slightly in that direction, could immediately be painted as anti-feminist, anti-gay, battening down on people who, for reasons of their own, simply weren't able to find a partner, or
Right.
doubling the misfortunes of those who've lost their children, etc., and on and on. I think it would be politically
Yeah.
impossible. All right, now because this cannot possibly continue, we're never going to reach that 207 million in Europe. Something else has to happen, and we all know what that something else is, and that's immigration. Now, immigration is, of course, a highly, highly contentious topic. And I want to stress here what I stressed in the book, maybe not enough, but I did stress it. Nothing I say in the book, nothing we're going to say here is going to be pro or anti-immigration, right? Obviously, there are some kinds of immigration that are obviously undesirable and that virtually everybody can see, but we're not wading into that one. What we're talking about here is the strict correlation between action, declining population, and consequence, the need for immigration, right? That's all we're saying here. It is the mirror image, or perhaps better, the obverse side of the coin of demographic collapse is a need for immigration, and not for immigrants who assimilate. Because if they assimilate in respect of their own birth rates, they don't solve our problem, or they do so only for their own lifetimes. It only works if they don't assimilate. And in most European or West European countries, the immigrants who have assimilated least, on average, gosh, let's rescue ourselves again from more hate-ons on the comments on YouTube or what have you. On average, are the Muslim immigrants, because they have a robust culture of their own that, for many of them, tells them to behave in a different way. Well, I predicted in Why the Rest Hates the West that the way we were going was that Europe would be more than 50% Muslim by 2100. Now, even making such a prediction could be stigmatized as racist. It wasn't at all. It was simply a mathematical calculation. It wasn't a particularly sophisticated one, and we'll come back to much more sophisticated estimates in a minute. Mine was strictly a back of an envelope, but it wasn't far wrong. What's the situation right now? Well, right now, the UK has 6% Muslim population, which is predicted to be 20% by 2050, partly because they are having far more children than the rest of the population, but partly because that's where a large number of the new immigrants are coming from. In France, it's 10%. In Germany, 6.5%, although I suspect that would be significantly lower if Angela Merkel had not admitted very nearly 1 million Muslim young men, and that's basically what they were, young men, in 2015, which itself is destabilizing on its own. In the Netherlands, 5%, in Sweden, 8.1%, and in Spain, 4.5%. Now, what are the likely political effects of a growing Muslim population in Europe? Well, one obvious thing is the backlash effect. Anti-immigrant parties in most European countries. And one of the things that's often not noticed, but it's very important, is that a lot of liberals are inclined to support these, right? Because they're afraid that Muslims might start to undo the liberal legislation in respect of abortion, gay rights, feminism, and so on. So we're now seeing people who would always have aligned themselves on the left switching over in some cases to what's often called the far right. It probably is the far right. There's also the difficulty that some European countries are already having, and this will increase mightily in supporting Israel. Just think of the shouting matches that have been going on in Britain over the past few years, mostly in the Labour Party under Corbyn, but since then, more generally, since the latest war just started in October last year, or in supporting US-led military initiatives in the Middle East. They're going to find it much harder electorally to pitch in behind the US. And also, we're seeing a new wave of anti-Semitism in some places, most notably in France, but elsewhere too, sheltering under the fig leaf of opposition to the admittedly often abominable Israeli treatment of Palestinians. And of course, in the case of the current war, they've got a cause célèbre there. But that's leading not just to opposition to Israel in that conflict, but to actually to anti-Semitic attacks. What about the US? Well, only a very small proportion of immigration into the US is actually Muslim, and they tend, some exceptions notwithstanding, to integrate pretty well. But the foreign born share of the US population is higher now than at any time since the First World War. This graph shows absolute numbers. Of course, the US population is far bigger now than it was in 1915, say. But as a proportion of all the people living in America, right, about 1 in 6 were not born in the US. What are the political effects of that? Well, again, a nativist backlash. We've seen this before. The Know Nothings in the mid 19th century, hostility to the Irish after the 1840s and to Eastern Europeans in the late 19th century, and the popularity of Trump in the present. Now, I guess our news feeds are filled every day with either Trump or his entourage railing about the border.
Yes. Yeah, we got to build that wall, apparently.
Right, right. Well, certainly, it would certainly be true that many Americans are feeling threatened, but not necessarily physically, although that too, and of course, outrageous crimes committed, particularly by illegal immigrants, are getting quite rightly very high profile news coverage. But perhaps the
Yes.
thing that's really motivating far more people than that is the squeeze on the incomes of the unskilled. Right? There's loads of unskilled workers who are already finding very, very hard to make ends meet. And now suddenly there's millions of
Mhm.
more unskilled people who will work for even less than they can or will. And that's just battening down their wages further. And of course, it's quite possible to see this is the classic strategy of populist politicians to say that the top, the elite, are in cahoots with an outgroup against you, the real people of this country. Right? And that has some plausibility because big corporations are going to be, and major employers are going to be perfectly happy with very low wage immigrants. They're not going to be very keen on keeping them all out because they can reduce wages. And there's a whole load of ordinary people in the middle who feel like the whole system's rigged against them. And there is the opportunity for populist politicians like Trump.
Right. Yes.
But the other thing is anxiety at cultural change. People feel society's changing around them, and they no longer fit in. They don't like it, and that's again very understandable. And it's leading, as we're seeing in America, to shifting balance between political parties in some states. Well, let's do a quick strato cruise through 4 books. 2 I don't think much of, and 2 well, the last one in particular I think is really good. So, as I said, when I touched on this subject in the culmination of my book and saying, look where these Western anti-values have led us, I was going out on a bit of a limb. But in the following years, there were a whole load of books of this sort. Well, of this sort, making the same general point, but making slightly different conclusions from it to what I was. Now, on the uber doomsayer end of the journalistic market is Mark Steyn. For those unfamiliar with him, he is extremely funny, absolutely scathing in the points that he makes. Some of the stuff he says is factually just wrong, but he often really makes you think anyway. And in his book America Alone in 2006, he argued that Europe was going to be totally Islamized and America wasn't going to have any natural friends and allies to play with in the world that was coming. He saw things even more drastically than I did and was a little less gentle about it. The next book from Philip Jenkins was, if anything, too measured. Now, he's a very interesting historian. And in 2007, he argued, yes, Europe was being transformed, but it was going to be gradual. It will be fine. There'll be a soft landing. Loads of these people will be assimilated. Plus, there's loads of Christians coming in from sub-Saharan Africa, so it's not going to change things too much. And don't worry about it, people. That's caricaturing him a little, but not entirely unfair. Our next book is coming from a nasty right winger called Christopher Caldwell, who is banging on about the dangers of immigration in Europe. Reflections on the Revolution in Europe is deliberately echoing Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France in the late 18th century, a book we discussed in a previous episode. I think he's trying to cover himself in the glory of an infinitely better writer than he himself is. But, okay.
Oh dear.
I think the most despicable thing about his book, even though he makes a number of valid points, is that he does not talk at all about the cause of it. The cause is not that Western governments are being pathetic and letting all these immigrants, they've got to stop it, um, but that these immigrants are needed. As Mark Stein said, pithily but nicely, immigrants are the kids that you were too busy having Greek holidays to want to have. Right? You're going to need them. And he doesn't go into that area at all. Right? And I would
Mm.
maintain vociferously that anybody in Western countries, whether in America or in Europe, who complains about immigration has no right to do so at all, unless they, preferably by personal example, but at least can see and are equally prepared to talk about the importance of the West's demographic collapse and how we need to change that.
Right.
Well, the book that gets it right for my money and puts me straight is this man, Eric Kaufmann. Eric Kaufmann is a Jewish Canadian who's made his whole academic career in Britain. He's a sociologist and he's very secular. The title of his book, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? It's quite clear through every page and at the end that he desperately wanted the answer to his own question to be no, but concludes reluctantly but emphatically that the answer is yes. That there is, as I had said in Why the Rest, a strong correlation between birth rates and religiosity of populations, not just in Europe and America, but elsewhere on the planet as well. And so, yeah, that's one of the main things he points out. He also he estimates that Europe will indeed become majority Muslim, but by 2130, not as I had said by 2100. And I yield to him instantly. My calculations were the merest back of an envelope job. His are incredibly sophisticated, and anybody who wants to disagree with him is going to have to go into his level of research and mathematical modeling and match him on that.
This coming back to your point that religious people tend to have more children
Right.
than non-religious.
Yes. Yes. Partly because they're likely to put greater emphasis on marriage, which is itself far more likely to produce not just having children in itself, but having children in a safe, nurturing environment, at least. And because I suppose they're going to have a more hopeful outlook on the world, and they're likely, on average at least, to be less hedonistic. All of these things together, yes. And
Right.
also, I suppose, in a religious environment, again, women are more likely to feel that they can rely on their husbands for being there in the future, and so more likely to have children for this reason as
Yeah.
well. Okay, what about emissions in my book? Well, major things that I did not pay attention to. Firstly, the rise of China and India. These were already happening, but they didn't seem to me to impinge on some of the central arguments of my book. But since then, they've become massive and unignorable. The digital revolution and the polarization of wealth in Western economies. At the time I was writing, we were getting used to the internet, and emails seemed to be a jolly good thing, and you could stay in touch with people all around the world, and this was great, and we were going to have paperless offices. And I don't know about other people, but certainly I didn't think far beyond that. But of course, what has happened since is that the digital revolution, has created massive changes in the economy, which we'll deal with in just a moment, and that is going to impact all of this as well. But also the tailing off of birth rates in a lot of the rest of the world, which I did not anticipate. I saw this as being, with the exception of places like Japan and Russia, basically an exclusively Western disease. And about that, I was wrong. The They've tailed off everywhere except in Africa, which is continuing to have an explosion, a population explosion, again, which we'll look at a little more in a minute.
If I had a a sort of sneaky side to my personality, which of course I
No,
don't.
no,
I
no.
would love to send this par yeah, this particular slide to all of the former students who endured your oppression
Oh,
of East meets West and say, "Look, even though he forced us to read the book that he wrote himself, he's admitted now that some things were wrong about it."
oh, for sure, for sure. And we'll say more about precisely those in a minute. Yeah, yeah. Well, I'd just like to mention two more books that deal with some of these huge changes, which Why the Rest did not look at all. Firstly, The Technology Trap by Carl Frey. Fantastic book. Came out, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago. And he's dealing with the consequences of the digital revolution and making a parallel between that and the Industrial Revolution. And what the Industrial Revolution did was cause huge economic growth, but it all went to the hands of a few people who controlled what Karl Marx would have called the means of production. And that's exactly what we're seeing now, that there's economic growth, but it's all going into the hands of the tech companies and of those individuals employed in these general lines of work. But for other people, it marks a net loss. As with the Industrial Revolution, there were previously well paying skills that are suddenly either worthless or greatly reduced in their market value. And one of the things that that's led to is a shrinking middle class. Right? So in the 1950s, it was easily thinkable that even a, a semi skilled worker working in, say, a car factory could buy a house and bring up a family. That just seems like madness now, right? Nothing of the sort. You can have both partners working like crazy, maybe one of them on two jobs, and they still can't even afford to get a deposit on a modest home. So what's happened is that the middle class, a few have got sucked up into the new economy, but the large majority have sunk down to a much lower level of living. Now, I'm guessing again that you will have found amongst your cohort in Houghton that loads of people graduated and couldn't find graduate level employment and have spent the next decade or so being baristas somewhere or something not much better. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And unfortunately, it's not just a Houghton issue. Something I hear a lot about.
The other point, and this is a book that I know you and I discussed some years ago, The Scramble for Europe. This is a short book, maybe just a couple of hundred pages, and I would say it's the best book on any subject I've read in the last decade. It caught my eye because the title made me laugh. Because he's obviously riffing on the old idea of the scramble for Africa, the colonial powers in the late 19th century chasing one another to grab bits of Africa and add them to their empire. The scramble for Europe is Africans emigrating en masse to Europe. Sub Saharan Africa is the last place in the world that still has rapidly rising population levels. It had a population in 1960 of 300 million people, more recently of a billion, more than 60% of whom are under 30 years of age, and in the cities, you can call that 80% plus. Well, let's look at this little chart here. And I don't know whether I've organised this terribly well. The column we should probably look at first is the world population total one. Right. So in 1960, the world population was 3 billion. Now look at the first column. The world population minus Africa was 2.7 billion because Africa was 300 million. In 2019, world population was 7.5 billion, but 1 billion of those were Africans. In 2050, world population is predicted to be 10 billion. It started to crest towards flattening out, actually, of whom a quarter will be Africans. So they were 10% of world population in 1960. They're going to be a quarter of world population in 2050. And in 2100, look, the world population minus Africa will fall in the second half of this century. But the African population will surge to 4.4 billion, and there'll be 40% of the world's population. Now, again, as with my little chart a few slides back talking about the European population being just 207 million in 2100. That's entirely hypothetical. That will never happen. It cannot happen. 4.4 billion people cannot possibly be supported by Africa. It's struggling now. So there's going to be
Hmm.
cataclysms inside Africa, wars, particularly resource wars, and there's going to be vast, and I mean really, really vast immigration. And where are they going to go? Well, the Atlantic is too wide to swim, and most of those people sure can't afford the airfare. Going over over the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia is not particularly appealing. They're going to cross the Mediterranean. They're going to go to Europe. And so the squabbles that European governments are having now about keeping out boats are going to be dwarfed, totally dwarfed, by what's coming. Okay, to finish, where was Why the Rest right in its predictions, and where was it wrong? Well, firstly, Europe will indeed become majority Muslim, but probably not until 2130. I defer totally to Kaufman rather than my 2100. The causes of plummeting birth rates are not exclusively the product of Western anti values, even though, as we can see in various parts of the world, the linkage is strong. But that's not the sole thing, otherwise, they wouldn't be falling everywhere except sub Saharan Africa. I predicted volatile politics as a result of the changing demography by the 2030s. And I was wrong. It's already here. I predicted volatile politics and what we can call fascism light. Not really fascism, but nevertheless something scarily looking that way. And it's already here and has been since the mid 2010s, and for exactly the reasons forecast. Why the rest did not envisage and so took no account of was the dramatic economic and social consequences of the digital revolution, nor of the evolution of mere political correctness as it then was into woke and the political and culture wars consequences of that which we see around us. So, yeah, I think on balance, I feel, well, I'm not happy at what's happened. Of course, I'm not happy. But I feel that the general drift of the book is, in essence, vindicated by what's happened since.
Right. Yeah, but at the risk of sounding a little facetious, I guess,
You for see?
if and yeah, never in my
No.
life. Um, yeah, but if the predictions, not just your predictions, but predictions of other people before, as we looked at in the beginning, were not always necessarily accurate. I mean, reason says that we could have the same situation here. Sure, it looks like it's going in this direction right now,
Yes.
but we're not really guaranteed that because there might be other factors that we can't necessarily see. And I think that's the trouble with all of this stuff is that you don't see the outcomes of lots of these changes for several generations. And so
Right.
how would you know?
Right. Nearly all such predictions, whether it's someone like Ehrlich in 1968 or yours truly in 2004, are basically saying, well, look at the path that we're on now and look at where it leads. And of course, even by 2004, I could come to a diametrically opposite conclusion. Um, so yeah, there's loads that can happen between now and 2100, and certainly will. And also consider at whatever point in time you're standing and making these kind of predictions, you're doing it on the basis of all other things being equal, but they never are. And there's almost certainly something going on while you're talking that you're not giving nearly enough weight to, as was true of me in respect of the
Mm,
digital revolution, for example, that's going to transform
right.
things even more. But what you can say is that no society has ever in history come out of the kind of demographic decline that Western countries are in now. It's never, ever
Mm,
happened. And
right.
there's also a more general point that big demographic changes tend to be self reinforcing. And if anybody watching this now is
Mm.
going over the reasons why they either don't want children, or perhaps they do want children, but they're afraid that they couldn't, it was going to be difficult for them. Well, think about the reasons for that. What are the reasons? And they're the kind of reasons we've already been discussing in this series, and indeed even a little bit today. So that is itself part of the self-reinforcing downward tug, which will be stronger again in the next generation.
Right, right. Yeah, that was the other question I wanted to ask you was how does this relate back to the overarching theme of the book, which is why other non-Western countries take such issue with the West.
Well, in some ways, I mean, the overarching theme of the book is that non-Western populations resent the export of our anti-values into their societies, because it undermines their stability, which they absolutely need in the absence of our hyper prosperity. Our anti-values are things we can only afford
Right.
by being this kind of prosperous. Except that even we are finding that the embrace of those anti-values is making us significantly less prosperous. Um, Even us. But if I'm living in a society that hasn't got this in the first place, then this is the last thing we need. When it's like a hole in the head, and so that resentment's going to be
Yeah.
there all the more. So yeah,
Mm.
that really is, I think, the overarching theme of the book. Why the rest hates the West. Yeah.
I thought it might be good to have a nice little synopsis there in closing.
Yeah. I think so, and maybe this will encourage fights over Sunday lunch, if people still have such things as Sunday lunch, or whatever in the workplace, and so on. But yeah, okay. Well, thank you for staying with us, everybody. We're going to be starting on a brand new series next Sunday, and please, if you like this or if you didn't like it at all, repost it on social media, make comments, get debate started, and yeah, we'd be very grateful for that. Okay, so bye bye now from both of us, and we'll see you again
Next week.